Charlemagne, also called Charles I and Charles the Great, was born sometime between 747 and 748 AD, and he eventually became king of the Franks in 768, king of the Lombards in 774, and the first emperor of the Romans of what was to be called the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD. Around the time of his birth, his father, Pippin III, also known as Pippin the Short, was mayor of the palace, an official serving the Merovingian king, but actually wielded effective power over the extensive Frankish kingdom. Little is known about Charlemagne's youth, but it suggests that he received practical training for leadership by participating in the political, social, and military activities associated with his father's court. His early years were marked by a succession of events that had immense implications for the Frankish position in the contemporary world. In 751, with papal approval, Pippin seized the Frankish throne from the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. After meeting with Pope Stephen II at the royal palace of Pantheon in 753 AD, Pippin forged an alliance with the Pope by committing himself to protect Rome in return for papal sanction of the right of Pippin's dynasty to the Frankish throne. Pippin also intervened militarily in Italy in 755 and 756 to restrain Lombard threats to Rome, and in the so-called Donation of Pippin in 756, he bestowed on the papacy a block of territory stretching across central Italy, which formed the basis of a new political entity, the Papal States, over which the Pope ruled. When Pippin died in 768, his realm was divided according to Frankish custom between Charlemagne and his brother Carloman. Almost immediately, the rivalry between the two brothers threatened the unity of the Frankish kingdom. Seeking advantage over his brother, Charlemagne formed an alliance with Desiderius, king of the Lombards, accepting as his wife the daughter of the king, to seal an agreement that threatened the delicate equilibrium that had been established in Italy by Pippin's alliance with the papacy. The death of Carloman in 771 ended the mounting crisis, and Charlemagne, disregarding the rights of Carloman's heirs, took control of the entire Frankish realm. The distinguishing mark of Charlemagne's reign was his effort to honor the age-old customs and expectations of Frankish kingship, while responding creatively to the new forces impinging on society. His personal qualities served him well in confronting that challenge. The ideal warrior chief, Charlemagne was an imposing physical presence, blessed with extraordinary energy, personal courage, and an iron will. He loved the active life, but he was no less at home at court, generous with his gifts and adept at establishing friendships. Never far from his mind was his large family, 5 wives in sequence, several concubines, and at least 18 children over whose interests he watched carefully. Although he received only an elementary level of formal education, Charlemagne possessed considerable native intelligence, intellectual curiosity, a willingness to learn from others, and religious sensibility, all attributes which allowed him to comprehend the forces that were reshaping the world about him. These facets of his persona combined to make him a figure worthy of respect, loyalty, and affection. He was a leader capable of making informed decisions, willing to act on those decisions, and skilled at persuading others to follow him. The first 3 decades of Charlemagne's reign were dominated by military campaigns, which were prompted by a variety of factors. The need to defend his realm against external foes and internal separatists, a desire for conquest and booty, a keen sense of the opportunities offered by changing power relationships, and an urge to spread Christianity. His performance on the battlefield earned him fame as a warrior king in the Frankish tradition, one who would make the Franks a force in the world once contained in the Roman Empire. Charlemagne's most demanding military undertaking pitted him against the Saxons, who were longtime adversaries and whose conquest required more than 30 years of campaigning from 772 to 804 AD. This long struggle led to the annexation of a large block of territory between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, and was marked by pillaging, broken truces, hostage-taking, mass killings, deportation of Saxon rebels, draconian measures to compel acceptance of Christianity, and occasional defeats. While the conquest of Saxony was in progress, Charlemagne also undertook other campaigns. As soon as he became sole king in 771, he repudiated his Lombard wife and his alliance with her father, King Desiderius. Soon after, in 773, he answered the appeals of Pope Adrian I for protection by leading a victorious expedition into Italy, which ended up with his assumption of the Lombard crown and the annexation of northern Italy. During this campaign, Charlemagne went to Rome to reaffirm the Frankish protectorate over the papacy and to confirm papal rights to the territories conceded by Charlemagne's father. Concerned with defending southern Gaul from Muslim attacks and beguiled by promises of help from local Muslim leaders in northern Spain, who sought to escape the authority of the Umayyad ruler of Cordoba, Charlemagne invaded Spain in 778. That ill-considered venture ended in a disastrous defeat of the retreating Frankish army by Gascon forces, immortalized 3 centuries later in the epic poem The Song of Roland. Despite this setback, Charlemagne persisted in his effort to make the frontier in Spain more secure. In 781, he created the subkingdom of Aquitaine, with his son Louis as king. From that base, Frankish forces mounted a series of campaigns that eventually established Frankish control over the Spanish March, the territory lying between the Pyrenees and the Ebro River. In 788, Charlemagne forcibly annexed Bavaria, whose leaders had long resisted Frankish overlordship. That victory brought the Franks face to face with the Avars, Asiatic nomads who during the late 6th and 7th centuries had formed an extensive empire largely inhabited by conquered Slavs living on both sides of the Danube. By the 8th century, Avar power was in decline, and successful Frankish campaigns in 791, 795, and 796 hastened the disintegration of that empire. Charlemagne captured a huge store of booty, claimed a block of territory south of the Danube in Carinthia and Pannonia, and opened a missionary field that led to the conversion of the Avars and their former Slavic subjects to Christianity. Charlemagne's military successes resulted in an ever-lengthening frontier which needed to be defended. Through a combination of military force and diplomacy, he established relatively stable relations with a variety of potentially dangerous enemies, including the Danish kingdom, several Slavic states along the eastern frontier from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans, the Lombard Duchy of Benevento in southern Italy, the Muslims in Spain, and the Gascons and Bretons in Gaul. The Italian scene was complicated by the Papal States, whose boundaries remained problematic, and whose leader, the Pope, had no clearly defined political status relative to his Frankish protector, now his neighbor as King of the Lombards. In general, Charlemagne's relations with Pope Adrian I were positive and brought him valuable support for his religious program and praise for his qualities as a Christian leader. The expanded Frankish presence in Italy and the Balkans intensified diplomatic encounters with the Eastern emperors, which strengthened his Frankish position with respect to the Eastern Roman Empire. Charlemagne also established friendly relations with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the Anglo-Saxon kings of Mercia and Northumbria, and the ruler of the Christian kingdom of Asturias in northwestern Spain. By combining the traditional role of warrior king with aggressive diplomacy, Charlemagne elevated the Frankish kingdom to a position of leadership in Europe. While responding to the challenges involved in enacting his role as warrior king, Charlemagne was mindful of the obligation of a Frankish ruler to maintain the unity of his realm. This burden was complicated by the ethnic, linguistic, and legal divisions between the populations brought under Frankish domination over the course of 3 centuries of conquest, beginning with the reign of the first Merovingian king, Clovis. As a political leader, Charlemagne was not an innovator. His concern was to make more effective the political institutions and administrative techniques inherited from his predecessors. The central directive force of the kingdom remained the king himself, whose office by tradition empowered its holder with the right to command the obedience of his subjects and to punish those who did not obey. For assistance in asserting his power to command, Charlemagne relied on his palatium, a shifting assemblage of family members, trusted lay and ecclesiastical companions, and assorted hangers-on, which constituted an itinerant court following the king as he carried out his military campaigns and sought to take advantage of the income from widely scattered royal estates. A critical component of the king's effectiveness and a matter of constant concern for Charlemagne was the army, in which all free men were obligated to serve at their own expense when summoned by the king. Increasingly important in maintaining the military establishment, especially its armored cavalry, was the king's ability to provide sources of income, usually land grants, that enabled his subjects to serve at their own expense. The resources required to sustain the central government were derived from war booty, income from royal estates, judicial fines and fees, tolls on trade, obligatory gifts from noble subjects, and to a very limited degree, direct taxes. To exercise his authority locally, Charlemagne continued to rely on royal officials known as counts, who represented royal authority in territorial entities called counties. Their functions included administering justice, raising troops, collecting taxes, and keeping the peace. Bishops also continued to play an important role in local government. Charlemagne expanded clerical involvement in government by increasing the use of royal grants of immunity to bishops and abbots, which freed their properties from intervention by public authorities. This privilege, in effect, allowed its recipients or their agents to rule over those inhabiting their property as long as they enjoyed royal favor. The effectiveness of this governance depended largely on the abilities and the loyalty of those who filled offices at the local level. Charlemagne recruited most royal officials from a limited number of interrelated aristocratic families who were eager to serve the king in return for the prestige, power, and material rewards associated with royal service. Charlemagne's most innovative political measures involved strengthening the links between his person, his palatium, and local officials. He made full use of the traditional Frankish annual assembly, the mustering of those called to military service in a context which highlighted the common bond in their willingness to follow their leader into war. Charlemagne expanded the function of these meetings to make them an instrument for cementing the king's personal ties with counts, bishops, abbots, and powerful magnates. At these assemblies, he heard their complaints, accepted their advice, gained their assent for his policies, and delivered to them in his own words his commands for ruling his realm. The network of families from which the king selected most of his officials provided important channels through which pressure could be applied to assure that royal commands were executed locally. In addition, Charlemagne required all his free subjects to swear under oath, to obey the king, and to conduct themselves in ways that contributed to peace and concord. Especially important in strengthening the king's hand politically was Charlemagne's practice of establishing personal ties with powerful figures by accepting them as royal vassals as long as they remained loyal. Charlemagne integrated the central and local administration by regularizing and expanding the use of missi dominici, royal agents charged with making regular circuits through specifically defined territorial entities to announce the king's will, to gather information on the performance of local officials, and to correct abuses. The greatly expanded use of written documents as a means of communication between the central and the local governments allowed for greater precision and uniformity in transmitting royal orders and in gathering information about their execution. Among these documents were the royal capitularies, quasi-legislative documents dispatched across the kingdom to set forth the king's will, and to provide instructions for enacting his orders. The record of Charlemagne's reign indicates his awareness of new developments affecting economic and social conditions. Although scholars are divided on the importance of his actions, the evidence suggests that he was concerned with improving the organization and techniques of agricultural production, establishing a monetary system better attuned to actual exchange operations, standardizing weights and measures, expanding trading ventures into areas around the North Sea and Baltic Sea, and protecting merchants from excessive tolls and robbery. Royal legislation sought to protect the weak against exploitation and injustice. Although his economic and social initiatives were motivated chiefly by his moral convictions, these measures gave modest impetus to the movements that eventually ended the economic depression and social instability that had gripped Western Europe since the dissolution of the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. Drawing on the Old Testament and the teachings of St. Augustine of Hippo on the nature of the city of God, Charlemagne and his advisers progressively saw the king's position as bestowed by God for the purpose of realizing the divine plan for the universe. This new role entailed a vast expansion of traditional royal authority and a redefinition of the priorities that government should serve. Charlemagne's military conquests, diplomacy, and efforts to impose a unified administration on his kingdom were impressive proof of his ability to play the part of a traditional Frankish king, and his religious policy reflected his capacity to respond positively to the forces of change working in his world. Charlemagne's response to the growing urge in his world to deepen spiritual life was to make that objective a prime concern of public policy and royal governance. His program for meeting his royal religious responsibilities was formulated in a series of synods made up of both clerics and laymen summoned by royal order to consider an agenda set by the royal court. The enactments of the councils were given the force of law in royal capitularies, which all royal officials, but especially bishops, were expected to enforce. That legislation, traditional in spirit and content, was inspired by a conviction that the norms required to correct the deficiencies besetting Christian life in the 8th century had already been defined by Scripture and by earlier church councils and ecclesiastical authorities. Charlemagne's activities during the first 30 years of his reign were a prelude to what some observers viewed as the culminating event of his reign, his coronation as Roman emperor. In considerable part, that event was the consequence of an idea shaped by the interpretation given to Charlemagne's actions as ruler. Over the years, some of the king's chief political, religious, and cultural advisers became convinced that a new community was taking shape under the aegis of the king and the Frankish people. They spoke of that community as the Imperium Christianum, comprising all who adhered to the Orthodox faith proclaimed by the Roman Church. This community accepted the dominion of a monarch, increasingly hailed as the new David and the new Constantine, the guardian of Christendom and the executor of God's will. Concern for the welfare of the Imperium Christianum was heightened by the perceived unfitness of the heretical emperors in Constantinople to claim authority over the Christian community, especially after a woman, Irene, became Eastern Emperor in 797 AD. In a larger sense, developments in the 8th century produced the perception that the Latin West and the Greek East were diverging in ways that negated the universalist claims of the Eastern emperors. Then, in 799, an even greater threat to the well-being of Imperium Christianum emerged. The Pope's capacity to lead God's people came into question when Pope Leo III was physically attacked by a faction of Romans, including high functionaries in the papal curia, who believed that he was guilty of tyranny and serious personal misconduct. Leo fled to the court of his protector, whose role as rector of Christendom was now dramatically revealed. Charlemagne provided an escort that restored Leo III to the papal office. Then, after extensive consultations in Francia, he went to Rome in late 800 to face the delicate issue of judging the vicar of St. Peter and of restoring order in the Papal States. After a series of deliberations with Frankish and Roman clerical and lay notables, it was arranged that in lieu of being judged, the Pope would publicly swear an oath purging himself of the charges against him. 2 days after Leo's act of purgation, as Charlemagne attended Mass on Christmas Day in the Basilica of St. Peter, the Pope placed a crown on his head, while the Romans assembled for worship proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The new title granted Charlemagne the necessary legal authority to judge and punish those who had conspired against the Pope. It also provided suitable recognition of his role as ruler over an empire of diverse peoples and as guardian of Orthodox Christendom, and it gave him equal status with his tainted rivals in Constantinople. By once again sanctioning a title for the Carolingians, the Pope strengthened his ties with his protector and added luster to the papal office by virtue of his role in bestowing the imperial crown on the new Constantine. After 800 AD, his religious reform program stressed changes in behavior that implied that membership in the Imperium Christianum required new modes of public conduct. He attempted to bring greater uniformity to the diverse legal systems prevailing in his empire. The terminology and the symbols employed by the court to set forth its policies and the artistic motifs employed in the building complex at Aachen reflected an awareness of the imperial office as a source of ideological elements capable of buttressing the ruler's authority. In 813, Charlemagne assured the perpetuation of the imperial title by bestowing with his own hands the imperial crown on his only surviving son, Louis the Pious. Charlemagne believed that the office had some value, and that he wished to exclude the papacy from any part in its bestowal. Charlemagne saw the imperial title as a personal award in recognition of his services to Christendom, to be used as he saw fit to enhance the ability and that of his heirs to direct the Imperium Christianum to its divinely ordained end. In January 814, Charlemagne fell ill with a fever after bathing in his beloved warm springs at Aachen. He died 1 week later. Writing in the 840s, the emperor's grandson, the historian Nithard, avowed that at the end of his life the great king had left all Europe filled with every goodness. On the assessment of Charlemagne's years as emperor, historians are not in full agreement. Some have seen the period as one of emerging crisis in which the activities of the aging emperor were increasingly constricted. Because Charlemagne no longer led successful military ventures, the resources with which to reward royal followers declined. At the same time, new external enemies appeared to threaten the realm, especially the Vikings and Saracens. Other historians, however, have stressed such things as increased royal concern for the helpless, continued efforts to strengthen royal administration, active diplomacy, the maintenance of religious reform, and support of cultural renewal, all of which they see as evidence of vitality during Charlemagne's last years. Charlemagne's feats as a ruler, both real and imagined, served as a standard to which many generations of European rulers looked for guidance in defining and discharging their royal functions. His religious reforms solidified the organizational structures and the liturgical practices that eventually enfolded most of Europe into a single church. His definition of the role of the secular authority in directing religious life laid the basis for the tension-filled interaction between temporal and spiritual authority that played a crucial role in shaping both political and religious institutions in later Western European history. His cultural renaissance provided the basic tools: schools, curriculae, textbooks, libraries, and teaching techniques, upon which later cultural revivals would be based. The impetus he gave to the lord-vassal relationship and to the system of agriculture known as manorialism, in which peasants held land from a lord in exchange for dues and service, played a vital role in establishing the seigneurial system, in which lords exercised political and economic power over a given territory and its population. The seigneurial system, in turn, had the potential for imposing political and social order and for stimulating economic growth. Such accomplishments certainly justify the superlatives by which he was known in his own time: Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, also Europae Pater, Father of Europe.